release of Ghana's provisional gross domestic product estimate for the third quarter of 2025, together with the monthly indicator of economic growth for September 2025. Ladies and gentlemen, today's release does three main things. First, it explains how our economy performed between July and September this year. Secondly, it shows us how different sectors contributed to that performance. And thirdly, it shares insights on monthly signals from the monthly indicator of economic growth that help us understand the direction of economic activities in between quarters. This matters because GDP tells us the value of everything we produce within our borders. As we know, GDP numbers would usually help the government to plan. The numbers will help businesses make investment decisions. They guide households as they think about jobs and living standards. And they also give researchers and development partners the evidence to understand our economy's health. So let's walk through the story of the GDP numbers for quarter 3 of 2025. But before we get into the results, I would like us to have an appreciation of the key terms in very simple language, because I'll be using some of the key terms in giving you the results. Nominal GDP is the value of all goods and services produced in the country, measured using the prices we see in the market today. These prices include the effects of inflation. Real GDP, on the other hand, takes out the effect of inflation, and it measures the true quantity of goods and services produced in the economy. This allows us to track real growth, not just higher prices. Real GDP growth rate tells us whether the economy is expanding or it is shrinking relative to the same period last year. So usually when we have a positive number, it means that the economy is expanding. And when we have a negative number, it means that the economy is contracting. GDP shares, as we'll show very soon, shows us how much each sector is contributing to the economy and at what we call basic prices. And this would exclude taxes and subsidies. Contribution to growth tells us how much each sector is adding to the overall GDP growth of the economy for the quarter. Now, we estimate GDP in 3 stages. We first would give you a provisional estimate of GDP, and then we'll revise it based on new data that we gather, and then we'll finalize it based on final data that we gather. Today's quarter 3 results that we'll be releasing to you are provisional because they are based on the most available data that we received from government institutions and private sector operators. When we get new information, this data will be updated and you'll be accordingly informed or updated as well. Ladies and gentlemen, we use a production and expenditure approaches to estimating our GDP. There is a third methodology, which is an income approach, and we hope to complement our production and expenditure approach with the income approach when we complete with the GDP rebasing exercise that we are currently embarking on. Now, with the production and expenditure approach, we are able to give you performance of the economy from the angles of agriculture, industry, and services. And with the expenditure approach, we're able to give you performance of the economy from the angles of consumption, investment, and the net exports. Now, let's jump quickly into the headline GDP figures for quarter 3 of 2025. Let's begin with overall. Nominal GDP for quarter 3 of 2025 is 339.4 billion Ghana cedis. Last year, in the same quarter, it was 293.1 billion Ghana cedis. The increase of 15.8% in the nominal GDP reflects both higher production and changes in prices. Non-oil GDP rose to 331.5 billion Ghana cedis, up from 278.5 billion Ghana cedis in quarter 3 of 2024. On the real side, that is, if we take away the effect of prices, the economy produced 50.8 billion Ghana cedi worth of goods and services in quarter 3 of 2025, compared to 48.2 billion Ghana cedis last year. This gives us a real GDP growth rate of 5.5% for quarter 3 of 2025. In quarter 3 of 2024, the rate was 7%. So growth is still positive, but slower than last year, same period. Non-oil real GDP grew by 6.8% compared to 7.8% a year ago. Again, this shows strong activity outside oil and gas, though slightly softer than last year. Let's provide some more color with regards to sectoral performance. And here we'll be looking at the performance in the agriculture, industry, and services sectors. Agriculture grew strongly at 8.6% in quarter 3 of 2025, making it one of the biggest drivers of the 5.5% growth, overall growth we observed in quarter 3 of 2025. The sector contributed 30% to the overall growth of 5.5%. And also, most of the growth was coming from fishing and the crop subsectors. In fact, these two subsectors actually lifted the growth in the agricultural sector. Even with a modest share of the economy, agriculture's contribution to growth was outsized, showing a sector that is recovering quickly and adding real weight to the national output. Now let's turn to industry. Industry expanded by 0.8%, contributing little, in fact, 4.7% to the overall growth. Manufacturing held up, but the sharp 8.2% contraction in oil and gas was enough to drag the whole industry sector down. Given its 32.1% share of the economy, industry's impact this quarter was muted, pointing to persistent weaknesses in extractive activities despite pockets of stability elsewhere. Now, services. Services delivered a 7.6% growth and remained the largest and strongest sector of the economy. With ICT, trade, transport, education all expanding, we've seen the services sector contribute the most to the 5.5% GDP growth we are recording in the third quarter of 2025. In fact, services contributed 59.5% to this growth. Now, let's look at the third quarter GDP growth versus trends. When we place the 5.5% growth rate beside recent trends, we see that the economy continues to grow steadily, even as some sectors experience adjustments. Growth in overall GDP, non-oil GDP, services GDP, and agriculture GDP in the third quarter of 2025 all surpassed their average growth rates for the period 2014 to 2025, quarter 3. It is only the industry sector whose growth was slower than the period average. The year-on-year picture is stronger than the quarter-on-quarter changes, which I will come to very shortly. Now, let's look at the seasonally adjusted quarter-on-quarter performance. The quarter-on-quarter real GDP increased by 1.3% in quarter 3 of 2025 after seasonal adjustment. This means that when we remove predictable patterns like crop harvest cycles or holiday demand, the underlying economy still expanded from quarter 2 to quarter 3 by 1.3%. Last year, the same quarter saw a 1.6% rise. So the economy is still growing, but at a slower pace, quarter to quarter, after removing the effect of seasons. Now, let's dive a bit deeper into sector by sector performance. And I want to start with the agriculture sector. Agriculture grew by 8.6% in the third quarter of 2025, as I mentioned earlier. This is a sharp rise from the 2.5% growth we recorded in quarter 3 of 2024. It's an important signal of recovery and resilience after the sector's challenge in previous years. Now, if you look at the data, you will see that fishing led the way in terms of growth with a remarkable 23.1% growth compared to a contraction of 6.4% same period last year. In simple terms, fishing bounced back strongly, and this helped lift agricultural growth. Fishing, however, contributed 5.1 percentage points to the 30% contribution of agriculture to the overall growth of 5.5% for the quarter. Now let's look at crops. Crops also expanded by 8.3% in the third quarter of 2025, registering the second highest growth, but posting the highest contribution to agricultural growth with a sustained improvement across major food and cash crops. Forestry and logging recorded the lowest growth of 0.8%, but higher than the contraction of 5.6% recorded in the same period last year. Forestry and logging continued their steady performance over the 5-year period from 2020 to 2025. Now, let's look at cocoa. In fact, cocoa continues to pick up in 2025, with growth improving from negative 21.4% in the third quarter of 2024 to a growth of positive 1.9% in the third quarter of 2025. The sector's growth showed a more mixed pattern over the period 2020 to 2025, reflecting weather conditions and global market dynamics. But this overall contribution stabilizes the agriculture picture. Now let's look at the sub-sectoral performance under industry. The industrial sector grew by 0.8%, as I mentioned earlier, in the third quarter of 2025. This is down significantly from the positive growth of 11.4% we saw in the same period of 2024. The biggest drag of the growth industry sector was oil and gas, which contracted sharply by 18.2% in the third quarter of 2025. This single subsector pushed the broader industrial growth rate downwards. Mining and quarrying also declined by 2.8%. In fact, mining and quarrying, we say, contracted, reflecting lower activity in some extractive operations. Manufacturing, however, expanded by 3.9%, down from 7.4% last year, but still positive. Manufacturing contributed the most to industrial growth in the quarter. This suggests that industrial firms increased output, supported in part by improved electricity supply and also more stable production schedules. Gold production, when tracked quarterly, shows signs of stabilization after we saw fluctuations during the past 5 years. Now, let's turn to services. Services remain the dominant force in the economy, growing at 7.6%, contributing 59.5% to the overall growth of 5.5%, and actually constituting the largest share of the economy at 39.7%, roughly 40% in the third quarter of 2025. Information and communication recorded the largest growth in the sector at 17%, up from 15.6% in the same period last year. The subsector also contributed the most to growth of 7.6% posted by the sector. In fact, the subsector's growth was 23.4 percentage points to industrial contribution of 59.5% overall growth. This subsector continues to expand rapidly as digital services, mobile applications, data services, and online commerce gain even more prominence in our economy. We observed other expanding subsectors, and this include the transport and storage subsector, which expanded by 10.4%, the trade subsector, which expanded by 10%, defense and social security subsector, which expanded by 6.3%, the education subsector, which expanded by 5.9%, and the financial and insurance subsector, which expanded by 4%. Health and social work saw mixed results with a contraction of 9.7% in the third quarter of 2025, reflecting adjustments in service delivery patterns. But it wasn't only health and social work that saw contraction. There were other subsectors whose activities witnessed contraction in the third quarter of 2025. And these subsectors include accommodation and food services, which contracted by 7.2%, and other personal service activities, which contracted by 3.5%. Ladies and gentlemen, we want to give you a very important data with regards to how the economy performed in the first 3 quarters of the year. What we have presented to you so far is the performance of the economy in the third quarter of 2025. But we now want to present to you, if you put quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3 together, making up the first 3 quarters of the year, which is January to September 2025, how did the economy perform? So when we compare January to September 2025 with the same 9 months of 2024, we see consistent growth across most of the non-oil subsectors. The economy is expanding in a balanced way, as the data is telling us, though with clear variations between sectors. The economy expanded by 6.1% in the first 3 quarters of 2025, higher than the 5.7% recorded in the same period in 2024. The non-oil economy, which excludes oil and gas, expanded by 7.5% in the first 3 quarters of 2025 compared to 5.7% in the same period in 2024. Agriculture grew by 7.4% and added 24.6% to overall GDP growth of 6.1% for the first 3 months, for the first 3 quarters of 2025, showing momentum driven mainly by crops and continued pickup in fishing. With a 25.6% share of the economy for the period, which is the first 3 quarters of the year, the sector remains a steady anchor and a key contributor to real sector expansion in 2025. Industry, for the first 3 quarters of the year, grew by 2.4%, contributing 13.1% to total growth. Despite its 33.2% GDP share, the sector's impact stayed modest as weak oil and gas and parts of mining offset the gains manufacturing is making. So industry is stabilizing but still lagging the broader economy. Services led the economy in the first 3 quarters of the year with 8.3% growth and the largest contribution of 57.4% for the period. Holding 41.3% of GDP, the sector remains the main engine of expansion, driven by strong ICT, trade, education, and transport activities. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at the sectors that are expanding and the sectors that are contracting. Here I'm talking about subsectors. And let's zero down on the top 5 expanding subsectors. Now, the top 5 expanding subsectors are fishing, which expanded by 23.1%, information and communication, which expanded by 17%, transport and storage, which expanded by 10.4%, and then trade, repair of vehicles and household goods expanded by 10%, followed by crops, which expanded by 8.3%. Let's look at the other side of the coin so that we'll be able to tell which subsectors contracted in the 3rd quarter of 2025. These subsectors are health and social work, which actually shrunk by 9.7%, accommodation and food services, which shrunk by 7.2%. Other personal service activities shrunk by 3.5%, and then mining and quarrying shrunk by 2.8%. Remember that I had mentioned earlier that oil and gas shrunk by 18.2%, and that's a component of the mining and quarrying contraction of 2.8%, which means that but for the oil and gas sector, subsector that shrunk by 18.2%, mining and quarrying would have possibly posted a positive growth rate. Now, as we do usually, when we get new data, we revise our GDP estimates. And so we received new data on VAT from GRA, new data on crop production from Ministry of Food and Agriculture, and new data on electricity generation, transmission, and distribution from VRA, NETCO, GRIDCO, and ECG. Now, with this new data, we have used the information to revise the Q1 and Q2 2025 GDP estimates. I must, however, emphasize that the revisions were minimal. So with the revisions, Q1 2025 real GDP growth rate has been revised marginally upwards from 6.33% to 6.36%. Q1 2025 non-oil real GDP growth rate has been revised marginally upwards from 7.7% to 7.72%. Then coming to Q2 2025 real GDP growth rate has been revised marginally upwards from 6.26% to 6.47%. And quarter 2, 2025, non-oil real GDP growth rate has been revised marginally upwards from 7.81% to 8.02%. Now, ladies and gentlemen, recall that the Ghana Statistical Service introduced a monthly indicator of economic growth in October this year as part of measures to provide high-frequency signals of economic activity and to support planning and early detection of economic turning points. We have so far reported on July monthly indicator of economic growth. We did that on 16th October. We've also reported on August monthly indicator of economic growth. We did that on 20th November. As more data arrives from MDAs, we'll keep giving you updates of these estimates. And I'm happy to announce to you that today we are able to provide to you the September performance. So in other words, not only are we updating you on quarter 3 GDP estimates, we are able to provide to you through the monthly indicator of economic growth, September growth estimates. Now for September 2025, we are reporting provisional results. I want to emphasize that. And as monthly data arrives from MDAs, and the index will be revised with those new data. So coming back to the data, for September 2025, the provisional monthly indicator of economic growth index stands at 108.5, compared with 103.0 in September 2024. That gives us a year-on-year growth rate of 5.3%. So this means that in September, the growth rate as measured by the monthly indicator of economic growth index is 5.3%. By sector, the agriculture sector expanded by 0.2% using this indicator. Industry expanded by 6.7%, and the services sector expanded by 5.4%. These 3 months, if we talk about the July that we released, the August that we released, and the September that we released, if you put them together, they tell a story about the quarter 3 GDP. Let's recall that for July 2025, we released the monthly indicator of economic growth to 5.7%. It was revised to 5.7%. Now, for August, the growth rate was revised to 5.4%. And I've just reported September of growth rates of 5.3%. If you put all of these together, they informed the quarterly growth rates of 5.5% we are recording for the third quarter of 2025. So, ladies and gentlemen, what are the key takeaways from today's presentation of our quarter 3 GDP estimates and the September monthly indicator of economic growth? The key takeaways are the following. 1, the economy grew by 5.5% in quarter 3 of 2025, slower than the 7% growth we witnessed in 2024, same period. But this growth is still strong. 2, non-oil GDP continues to perform well at 6.8% in quarter 3 of 2025, showing that Ghana continues to rely less on oil and gas to drive its economy. 3, the agriculture sector grew by 8.6% compared to 2.5% in the third quarter of 2024. This is good for farmers and for food prices. Fishing grew the largest at 23.1% compared to a contraction of 6.4% in the same period last year. Industry grew by 0.8% in the third quarter of 2025 compared to 11.4% in the same period last year. The oil and gas sector dragged industrial growth significantly with a contraction of 18.2%, but manufacturing was strong, growing by 3.9%, down from 7.4% in the third quarter of 2024. Services remained the strongest part of the economy. The sector grew at 7.6%, constituted the largest share of the economy at 40%, and contributed the most to the growth to quarter three growth at 59.5%, with ICT leading the way at 17% growth. The main drivers of GDP growth in quarter three 2025 are ICT, crops, trade, transport and storage, manufacturing, and education. And altogether, these drivers contributed 86% to the overall growth. Now, seasonally adjusted, Ghana's provisional real GDP growth was 1.3% in the third quarter of 2025, from 1.6% in the third quarter of 2024. The top 5 expanding sectors or subsectors are fishing, ICT, transport and storage, and trade. On the other hand, the 5 contracting activities from the data are oil and gas, which is part of mining and quarrying, which also contracted, health and social work, accommodation and food services, and other personal services. Ladies and gentlemen, based on the data, we have some practical actions that we believe each of the key stakeholders, households, businesses, and government should take note of and should consider implementing. For households, it would be good to take advantage of improving food conditions to rebuild savings. With crops and fishing surging, and with food price pressures easing, this is a moment that households should actually be spending wisely and be saving more. And for businesses, our recommendation is to invest where growth is strongest. It will be good to shift capital and effort towards ICT, trade, transport, crops, and manufacturing, where we are seeing the most of growth coming from. And as I mentioned earlier, if you put these sectors together, they are driving over 80% of quarter three growth. And for government, it will be important to stabilize industry while scaling up support for top performers. It's important to address the sharp oil and gas decline and reinforce high growth areas like the ICT, the trade, transport, and agriculture sectors to keep the economy's momentum strong. So what this means is that the implementation of the programs and activities earmarked to support industrial growth, particularly in the oil and gas sector in the 2026 budget, is very key, and they should be implemented religiously to boost up industrial growth. Ladies and gentlemen, we will continue. We acknowledge the support that we continue to receive from our stakeholders who give us data. I just want to use this opportunity to deeply appreciate all these institutions. In fact, we have a number of government sector institutions, MDAs, SOEs, that we get data from. But we don't get data from only these MDAs and MMDAs and SOEs. We also get data from enterprises. And also, we get data from individuals as well, who provide data to the service. And we want to use this opportunity to appreciate the support that we get from you. Your timely cooperation and provision of the data makes today's release possible. We encourage you to continue to provide accurate, complete, and timely data so that our national statistics reflect the true state of Ghana's economy. Let me again use this platform to reaffirm the commitment of the Ghana Statistical Service. We remain dedicated to producing timely, accurate, relevant, and credible statistics to support evidence-based decision-making for national development. Our mandate, as you know, is to provide data that strengthens policy, that enhances public accountability, and that supports overall national development. We'll continue to uphold the highest ethical and professional standards in our work. Thank you for your attention. And for further inquiries about the information we've given to you on the Q3 2025 GDP and the monthly indicator of economic growth for September, please contact the Director for Economy in the person of Mr. Francis Bright Mensah, who is seated at my right-hand side. We look forward to continued collaboration with all stakeholders as we work together to build a stronger statistical foundation for Ghana's development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lassa, for the presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have received the figures for September, monthly indicator of economic growth, and that of Q3, gross domestic products. We want to give opportunity for us to ask any question that might be bothering our minds, any clarification that you need, or any contribution that you want to make to improve the releases that we do. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll give you the mic to pose your question. Any question from those online? Not yet.
Okay, looks like we did all the explanation, right? Okay. Oh, Echo is coming. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Doc. So, Echo here. This is a prelim. I may come back. In the spirit of the oil transition and what have you, there is limited investments in the oil and gas sector. And I know Ghana is trying to vary the fiscal regime to attract more investors so that we don't have stranded assets in our deposits. So I tied that to your recommendation for government. I was trying to look for exactly what you said.
Yeah.
You were trying to encourage the government to focus more on efforts like ICT and what have you. I grant that.
Yeah.
But beyond that, are you able to also get your recommendation for high employment creating sectors? Yes. Because the oil has just been like a form of mirage. Something just hits into the account in there. But as to the job it creates versus the likes of ICT, are you able to tell us, given job quality and job sustainability, which areas would you encourage government to be more focused on, and by extension, maybe the banks, the Bank of Ghana, is also there, may also help with policy direction, where banks can direct investments or loans into certain sectors that are really high growth areas. Thank you.
Okay, let's take some more and then we can respond to them. All right, so let me take that. That seems to be the only question on the floor. Eko, once again, thanks for your question. So the recommendation we are making is that given the Q3 GDP estimate that we just released, and also the monthly indicator of economic growth, given the direction of the data, we are making some recommendations for household, businesses, and government. On the government side, we are recommending that it will be good to look at the sectors that are already performing and support them to perform better, or at least maintain that performance. And usually, when government is coming in, government is an enabler. It provides an enabling environment for the private sector to thrive. So whatever environment is needed to maintain these high-performing sectors and subsectors, that has to be done, and even for them to even do better. But we've also seen that for some time now, there's been contractions in the oil and gas production. And like you rightly said, it's a stranded, oil is a depletable resource. And after some time, it gets exhausted or it finishes. So you have to make sure that given that we are transitioning from fossil fuel to green economies, we have to make sure that the oil we have, we have access to it so that we can make the best out of it. Now, given that the sector has been seeing consistent declines in the past few years, it's important for us to take a look at what we can do to ensure that we are increasing production from the sector. Fortunately, in the 2026 budget, there have been a number of initiatives that government is undertaking to ensure that oil and gas investments are increased. And I think that is clearly outlined in the budget. So I think religious implementation of all of these interventions would really boost growth in the oil and gas sector and eventually the industrial sector. But I think you made a very important point about employment, and I couldn't agree with you more. So yes, employment is one of one of the key goals, macroeconomic goals of the economy, as was presented by the finance minister in the 2026 budget. That's job creation. And so as we talk about GDP, as we talk about the economic expansion, it's equally important for us to talk about the jobs that we are creating from the growth of the economy. So that's where your question is excellent, it's spot on. But I just want to emphasize that when we talk about growth with jobs or growth that goes with employment, it is not only the traditional sectors that we can see employment, in. Not only traditional like agriculture, etc. In fact, non-traditional sectors, or should I say, sectors like ICT, etc., even though they depend very much on technology, they could also generate a lot of employment. So it depends on how we are providing the necessary enabling environment for the sector to grab, to provide jobs. So for example, with data, advent of ICT, we have almost everybody gluing to data. That's why we have ICT actually increasing. And we know what the youth particularly can use ICT to do. In fact, this is one such area that the private sector can create a lot of jobs without dependence on government. If we can build capacity, capacitate the youth in ICT-related areas, they can take advantage of the growth in the sector and contribute for the sector to even grow more. And by so doing, we'll be creating jobs in those sectors. So I think I agree with you perfectly in that perspective. But I think it's a combination of a number of factors. So the financial services too, if you look at the growth, we saw that the financial services and insurance actually expanded by about 4%. So it's one of the subsectors that is also growing. And as we all know, finance is extremely important to fuel, to fuel the wheels of growth. And once it is growing, we also have to make sure that the necessary environment is created for credit to be made available to those who require credit to expand their economic activities. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. The name is Justice. I report for the Shenhua News Agency.
Yes.
Now, it's good news to hear that manufacturing is actually picking up, albeit, marginally. But I would like to see what actually, enabled the positive results we are seeing.
Okay.
Then, related to that is the ICT that you've spoken about. I want to actually see, because you mentioned data, data consumption, but what else is ICT doing? For instance, you go to other countries, ICT actually enables manufacturing.
Yep.
But over here, are we seeing that? Are there efforts being made to ensure that ICT is not just coming in to rob our pockets of money for data, but then it's actually contributing to growth? I know a lot of young guys have been developing, apps that support agriculture, that support the health sector. But when it comes to manufacturing, is ICT, playing a role in the marginal growth that we are seeing? Thank you.
Okay, good. Can we take some more? Okay, so I'll ask Mr. Francis to give us some more pointers with regards to the more details on manufacturing and also ICT. Then after that, I would add a few pointers. So Francis, over to you.
Thank you, GS. So if you look at the manufacturing sector, there are 23 activities that we look at. But the biggest of all is the manufacture of food products, which for that quarter, we saw that it had a growth of about manufacture of food products.
Yep.
Yeah. The second one is manufacture of beverages and manufacture of textiles. Now, these three that I've mentioned, altogether, for the 3.9 that we've seen, they form about 47% of the growth. So they really performed. But we had some contraction. There are other activities like manufacture of chemical and chemical products, rubber and plastic, electrical and optic products. They contracted. But the big pushers, which are these four activities: food products, beverages, textiles, and sometimes even printing. Yeah, they expanded. I think 6%, 4%, and 2%. So that really drove growth compared to what happened in the previous quarter. But for the contraction that we had in other activities, perhaps we could have had more expansion within the manufacturing subset. Thank you. Yes.
I think they talked about ICT as well. Yeah, but basically, the ICT sector benefited from data, the use of data, and also for calls as well, which expanded. But there are also other subsectoral activities that supported the growth in ICT, and this included computer programming. And then we have radio and television programs as well. And then, so those are some of the subsectors in the ICT that supported the growth. Yeah. Oh, definitely. That is part of the data, right? It's part of the data. Yes. Okay.
All right.
Yes.
Yeah, Doc.
Yes.
You know, the Bank of Ghana follows your work a lot. They also do a lot of data.
Okay.
Is there scope to sometimes also do a recommendation for them to also look in a certain direction? Many a times, I notice, especially lately, given inflation slowing, policy rate is being cut, but it takes a longer time for that transmission to fall through. I noticed that even at 5.5%, yeah, it's still fairly high above government's target of 4% for this year. But 5.5 is still like the lowest, I think, since I think the first or fourth quarter of last year or so. So it's appreciable, but it's still slow. Is there scope where you can also, based on the work you do, make some recommendations where this can translate into more finance for the special targeted areas? Of course, the 24-hour economy is yet to take off. And so if there's any scope, you can wind all of that in your recommendations, not to just government alone, but also the central bank, and maybe the finance and banking may also help us. Thank you.
Okay. Is there any more? Yeah.
I just want to know, still on the services sector,
Yeah.
the slight or the drop in expansion that we saw,
Okay.
what would you really attribute it to?
Okay. So let me take Eko's question, and then Francis will take the details with regards to the contractions we are seeing in the services subsector. So, Eko, like I said, I keep saying, the work we do is data. And the strategy is to ensure that we don't just end up by just producing and disseminating the data, but to make sure that we work with key stakeholders so that, number one, our data is understood, number two, our data is used, and number three, our data translates into desirable development outcomes. So that's the whole purpose. So that's why we try to engage a number of key stakeholders, including government, central bank, private sector players, even some households, to ensure that the data we are producing is supporting in national development. So that's a good question you've asked. So I must say that it's not enough for the central bank to use only our GDP data to make decisions. So usually what they will do is that they will take our GDP data, they will take our price data, they will take our employment data, and they will take other data that we produce, right, to inform the decisions that they make on the economy, particularly on the policy rates that they pronounce on and all that. I mean, they know how they do it. So we'll continue to ensure that we provide very granular data, disaggregated data, that will support all of these actions. And I'm sure that they do take the data and the recommendations we make, but you and I may not know the extent to which they use it, because they definitely would use other factors to influence their decisions. So for us, we'll continue to provide this data in a manner that will be useful to all key stakeholders to support national development. Thank you very much. Yeah. Francis, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So if you look at the services sector, we have about 12 activities in there. Now we had about 3 contractions within the sector. And some of the contraction came from some of the big movers, like transport and storage, which contracted. And if you look at the share of transport, even though it's 1.2, its contraction impacted on the expansion that we're getting from trade. And also we saw a contraction in health. It also has a big weight in the basket. The heavy movers, trade, did so well, 10%, but it was offset by the contraction that we had in the health, other services, and the transport and storage subsector activities.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I wanted to find out another follow-up. It sounds like that. When you talk about food production, is it manufacturing or processing? I wanted to find out because there is the growing phenomenon of young school leavers going into, prepared food production business. We've had watching on wheels and those things. But I also see some of them transitioning into packaging of, shito, etc. Are they part of the food production we are talking about here?
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I did mention manufacture of food products.
Yeah.
So manufacturing is any physical transformation that you do to a product. So once they've transformed the raw pepper and other into something, they come under manufacturing. They are classified as manufacturing. Manufacturing of beverages, the production of this drink that we, Sobulu and all those, they come under manufacturing.
If you are doing some, then your activity is part of what we are capturing.
Sorry, I think my attention has been drawn to, it's rather the accommodation and food services that contracted, it's not the transport sector. So thank you very much.
Yes. Yes, Francis, before you wrap up, let me use this. I had to express our appreciation to those we get data from. But equally important is the media who are with us every second. In fact, every time we call them, sometimes we call them at very short notice, but they are there for us. And for Ghana Statistical Service in particular, we are extremely happy that you would respond very quickly to our programs and all that. So I just want to use this opportunity to express our sincere appreciation to you as well. And please keep coming to our event and keep covering our event. The last time we met on CPI, there was a very great suggestion that we need to have a program, a sensitization program with the media with regards to some of the key releases that we make and the key terms that we use. And we promise that by next year, we would, inshallah, organize such a program so that we can engage you and have some more discussions on these areas. Because like I said, it is in our interest to promote statistical literacy so that you better appreciate what we present. You eventually are the ones who are going to sell the message for us. So it is in our interest to ensure that you understand what the data means so that when you are reporting, you can report accurately. So we thank you so much for that. Yeah.
Thank you, GS. And before we close, upcoming releases for a call, you talk about the party. Yeah, I think we'll have the CPI, the last one for December, on the 7th of January. So we will plan towards that. When we have the last one, then it's not 7th of January. Sorry, 7th of January, 2026. No, but it's not a holiday because they will push it to the weekend. So the CPI release for December, and but we'll still release the CPI on the 7th of January. And yeah, but it will be because it falls on a weekday. You realize now when it falls on a week, it's pushed to Friday. Yeah, so we'll be working on the 7th, and we'll be releasing the CPI on the 7th of January for December and for the whole of 2025. And also, you talked about the employment statistics, so we're hoping to give you employment statistics for January Q1 to Q3 of 2025 by 22nd of this month. 18th December. So maybe next week, we should be inviting you here. Then we also have the Prime Building Cost Index for November, and that will also be released before the year ends. And you have your October MEC release on January 22nd. January 22nd, 2026. Thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you on the 18th. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah.